Everybody knows what the Holocaust was. My father was killed and my beloved grandparents, whom I loved so dearly, they were all driven to the Danube and shot and their bodies thrown into the Danube. I had to forgive that and think of the suffering of Jesus Christ on the cross. I was risking my marriage. He would not believe in a God that would have allowed 6 million people to be thrown into the gas chamber. My name is Annette Tillemann Lantos. I was born in Budapest, Hungary, in the year of 1931. What year are we now? Annette, you don't...
2022.
2022?
Here's Tedra Reed.
Once she met my father, which was when she was 6 years old and he was 9 years old, they were both only children and they both would go together during the summer off to this lovely cottage with her family to enjoy time. When my mother turned about 12, there began to be changes in Hungary as Hitler began to loom large in Europe. By 1944, there was a desperate situation.
We heard it on the radio that the German SS troops are marching down the boulevard, and I told my mother, we have to put on our clothes and leave our home.
The next day, when they called back, they found out that the SS were already there to arrest them and take them away. Their belongings were being thrown into the street. They were so angry that they weren't there.
Of course, you know, they didn't know where we went, and the maid said she had no idea, and she didn't really, because we didn't obviously tell her. My cousin was the secretary of the Portuguese ambassador, and my grandmother told her that they have to take us into the embassy because the SS is already there to get us. They couldn't take everybody. They couldn't take my grandparents, my father, many others who stayed behind, and we never saw them again.
They drove through several countries where they were not welcome. Finally, they came to Switzerland. They were told they had to leave Switzerland. They went to France. In France, my grandmother brought my mother back to the Swiss border because she knew that they were allowing children still. And my mother had to go on a rather torturous path across the no man's land through barbed wire and then through a wet river in a very cold time of the year.
Luckily, I knew how to swim. The water became deeper and deeper, and then after a while, I managed to walk again and get out of the water on the other side. And then I had to go through another barbed wire, but the Swiss soldiers were there with their guns outstretched at me. But when they say I was, 13 years old, and I was always very small, so I looked about 8 or 9. And I never forget, they gave me a cup of hot chocolate.
And she was able to spend that year of the war in Switzerland. My grandmother could not bear the thought of returning to Hungary. And so my mother returned alone to Budapest, where one of her uncles had survived.
My father was killed, my grandparents, everybody, but this one uncle survived, and my boyfriend, Tom.
My father, who was her dear friend, was still alive. And she was heartbroken, though she was happy for him, that a year later my father won one of the very coveted scholarships to come and study in the United States.
From there, he sent me a visa to come to America and go to school here in Seattle.
My mother and father were married under a chuppah in Los Angeles. They came and settled in the San Francisco Bay Area. And during this whole period, my mother, especially once she was in Seattle, began a search to try to understand why she and my father were preserved when so many wonderful and important and valuable human beings were devoured in the flames of the Holocaust.
Especially when my first baby was being born, I knew I had to have some kind of a wider outlook on the meaning and purpose of life. I read about Buddhism, I read about meditation, I tried meditation. Everywhere I found something that was worth knowing, but that didn't fully satisfy me.
Her most powerful experience was reading the New Testament, a sort of good news version of the New Testament.
I got an overwhelming testimony that Jesus Christ was who he said he was. Even now it makes me cry when I think of it. And that was very hard to admit that. That was very hard to admit that.
As she began to look for a way to realize this revelation in her life, she received an amazing letter from her father. Her father, who had died in the Holocaust, had given her a Jewish prayer book for Passover when she was a little girl, almost 8 years old. Somehow it had been preserved. Somehow it came into the hands of her one surviving great auntie that she did not know well in Hungary. And in the book was a letter from her father that blessed her and let her know that he felt a storm was gathering that would not leave them unscathed, and expressed his concern that she would lose her faith.
He feared that in such eventuality he might not be by my side to kindle the fire of faith in my heart with his own living words. He reminded me of the passages in the Bible which state that in the last days God will turn the children's heart to their fathers and the fathers back to the children, and that young men will see visions and old men will dream dreams. He asked me for only one thing, and that was that I remain loyal to the God of my fathers, the God of Israel.
She did not know how she could remain faithful to her father's obviously very important request that had made its way across the chasm of death, and how she could remain faithful to Jesus, who had really opened her life and her spiritual understanding.
So I was quite confused and miserable. And that's when my friend Edna Wheelwright brought me the Book of Mormon. When I saw the introduction and what stood out for me in the introduction, that it was meant for a number of people, and among them were the Jews, then I thought, well, maybe I'm looking in the right place, maybe that has some relevance to me. I just opened the book, and started reading, and almost immediately I was hit by the fact that this was from God.
The stories reminded her so much of the stories of the Old Testament, but most powerfully, she opened to 3 Nephi 15.
Behold, I am he that gave the law to Moses. I am he who covenanted with my people Israel. Therefore the law in me is fulfilled.
When my mother read that, she realized that Jesus was the God of her father. He was Jehovah, whom her people had worshipped for so long and so faithfully, and that she could remain faithful to her personal experience with the Savior, as well as to her father's dying wish, by becoming a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
It wasn't easy. It was not easy. My husband would not accept it. I was risking my marriage, which was the most important thing in my life. We all adored my husband. I adored him, and my daughters adored him.
My father was just insanely brilliant and charismatic. They really had a love story for the ages, quite honestly.
To begin with, he was incredibly handsome and smart. That was the obvious.
They loved one another clearly and devotedly. This, though, the church was a sore spot.
The last thing that he expected or anticipated was that his Jewish sweetheart would join what he quite honestly viewed as something of an out there cult, if I'm being quite honest.
He would not believe in a God that would have allowed 6 million people to be thrown into the gas chamber. That to him was a sufficient reason to say, no, we are on our own here. I understood him, but I also knew that it wasn't enough for me. I wanted to join the church, but the local bishop would absolutely not baptize me unless I got permission from my husband. And so I gave up, I said, well, it wasn't in the books for me.
It was a few years later, she was in Australia visiting my one surviving grandmother. With my sister and I were with her. My father was making a television program, actually, in Europe.
I went to church in Melbourne and talked to the missionaries and told them the story. And they said, well, you have to meet with our mission president and tell him this story. And so they made me an appointment with Bruce McConkie, and I told him my story, and I told him I have a testimony, but they won't baptize me.
The president of the mission, Bruce R. McConkie, spoke with her on several occasions, and after those meetings said, I am going to give you permission to be baptized.
I wrote to my husband that I joined the church, and he was determined that it won't work, our marriage won't work that way. And he told me that, when I come back, we should be prepared to separate. So we managed for a while, and the girls had difficulty understanding why I had to cause that conflict every Sunday when I stood up and said, I'm going to church. The last time he threw a big plate of spinach on my white suit. But actually, that was sort of liberating. You could either scream or laugh, and I just broke down laughing, and we all broke down laughing. It was something to be on a movie screen.
And I remember asking my mother one day why she insisted on going to church, why she insisted on preparing classes to teach when it clearly annoyed my father.
And always the question came up, how can you let your wife sort of deny, her heritage by leaving her Judaism behind? And that was very hard, because he did not like it either. And always he was confronted with this question. And he gave an answer which said, my wife is a better Jew than you are. And after that, they didn't know what to make of that answer. And 6 months later, there was no more talk about divorce. He found that I became a much better person as a result, and he had to admit that.
I always had huge respect for my mother. I just respected what she was doing, respected her beliefs, respected the way she threaded that needle of supporting my father and being very committed, but also standing up for her right to live her life in accordance with her convictions and her conscience and her beliefs.
Believing in Jesus Christ did not promise an easy life. I was very aware of that. The opposition that I faced from my husband was a challenge to my faith. I had to continually justify my faith. Because of that opposition, my faith actually deepened, and I could understand more why it was so important in my life.
The best thing you can do for your children, for your family, is to find a way to love your spouse.
Now my mother, who, as I said, was an only child, has dozens of grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and we feel so blessed by this great gift that she has given us. Her courageous decision to go in the face of her beloved husband's strong conviction that she should not join this church, has blessed their entire posterity.
So she is sort of the story starter for our family. Both of my parents are. I feel like, yes, there are lots of interesting people in our history, but they started this story.
He knew that once he was gone, we are going to do his work in the temple. He knew that because we have done the work for our parents and for everybody else. And I think he sort of indicated that he will accept it. Finally, my husband realized that the church actually made all our life more meaningful. I became a better wife, our daughters became better daughters, and he became reconciled, I think, to the fact that we made the right decision. That is the story, brief story.